So today's talk is going to be on conversational design and bots. So first rule of thumb with bots is to always introduce yourself. So I'll just start by doing exactly that. As Sergey mentioned, I've worked in a couple investment banks. I've also been involved in several fintech startups and travel startups, which is where I started to sort of get more experience with bots and conversational design, and sort of spurred my interest in the area. Could I just get a quick show of hands? Who here has worked with conversational design or bots or been involved with it? Okay, great. So roughly about half of you. Well, for those of you who haven't, I hope that this provides enough information so that you feel confident to go out there and start building a bot. And for those of you who have worked with it, hope that it's thought-provoking in some way so we can continue to evolve the landscape. In the next 45 minutes, I'll cover a little bit of the history around bots. Where did they come from? How did they evolve into bots as we know today with conversational design? I'll look at a little bit whether or not a business really should look into building a bot. Is it all just hype, or is it worth investing into? The UX process, how it's applied to conversational design and bots. Where does it differ? Where is it the same? What are the things that we need to consider specifically as UX designers? And then end with some practical tips and tricks on how we can make sure that conversational design is successful. Before we dive into any of that, I know there's a lot of different words, NLP, artificial intelligence, machine learning. I was thinking we just break down those words and go through all the jargon around that. So first of all, what is a bot? A bot is a chatbot. A chatbot is a service powered by rules and sometimes artificial intelligence that you interact with via an interface. So the key word here that it's powered by rules. Artificial intelligence is hardware and software that was once that performs functions that was once only believed possible by a living brain. And this is where machine learning and deep learning are subsets of it. And then finally, natural language processing. This is what allows a machine to interpret unstructured text and extract meaning from it. So unstructured text would be the way we phrase things. We could say one thing in 10 different ways in a very unstructured way. The machine would extract meaning from that, and then off the back of that, execute a command. So respond with a response or something else. So what do I mean when I say conversational design? Today, I'll specifically focus around the designing of the dialogue between a human and a computer. It's a pretty versatile field. There's a lot of research and a lot of different processes around how you design the bots, how you can automate things in the background. But today, we'll focus specifically on the actual dialogue between you and a bot, be it messaging or Alexa, Siri, anything that involves conversation. So just to go into the history of the bots a little bit, I'd like to start with a quick little video from the Netflix show Hail and Catch Fire. Unfortunately, there's no sound, but there will be epic music playing. And you can see this guy comes in, plugs in a floppy disk into Macintosh. People don't know what's going to go on. And then suddenly the screen lights up and communicates to the people, "Hello, I'm Macintosh." And the reason I wanted to show this is because it just illustrates the point that bots are not actually a new thing. They've been around for decades. It's just that now, with natural language processing, strides in artificial intelligence, they're becoming a lot more interesting in the way that we can apply it to retail use and the way that we can interact with it today, rather than just being a very basic function on computers. So if we go all the way back to 1950, Alan Turing, who I'm sure we're all aware of who he is, the famous scientist, he created what we know today as the Turing test. And this was basically a test of a machine's ability to be able to exhibit intelligent behavior that's indistinguishable from or equal to a human being. So in this test, you could see a person behind a screen talking to another human being and a computer. And in order for the computer to pass the test, person C won't know if they're talking to a person or a machine. Back in 1950, this spurred a lot of interest among the scientific community to try to actually pass the Turing test. Was it possible to build a machine that people would actually think was real, like a real human being? It spurred a whole bunch of other bots that were created, but the one that I'd like to highlight next is in 1966, ELISA, probably the first ever chatbot developed by MIT professor Joseph Wiesenbaum. It was initially designed to imitate a psychotherapist talking to a patient in an initial evaluation. So basically, if you were, as a user, were talking to the bot, you'd say things like you or I or boyfriend, mother, father, and the bot would take your sentences and just reverse those sentences and feed it back to the user. Initially designed as a parody on the nature of the superficial conversation between a patient and a therapist in the very initial evaluation the first time, people actually felt emotionally connected with it, and they actually liked the bot, and they actually liked talking to it, even though they knew it was a bot. So that spurred even more interest around the bot community, being able to create a bot that people not just think is real, or even knowing that it's not real, but one that they can connect with. Fast forward to year 2000, Smarter Child was developed. It was released on AIM AOL messaging, our precursor to most of our messaging apps today. It was the first bot that took advantage of text messaging services. So that meant it was widely distributed. It developed intimate friendships with over 30 million users across the course of its lifetime, handled a wide variety of topics, wasn't just a niche topic, and became sort of like the yellow pages of the year 2000, and was pretty much the precursor to what we know today, our favorite intelligent and a little bit cheeky personal assistant. 2017, today, the bot landscape's changed significantly with all the strides that we've made with natural language processing. We've got Siri, Cortana, Alexa. Nearly every large software company has announced some sort of bot strategy that they'd like to make happen within the next 5 years. So, knowing a little bit about the history of the bot, the next question is it really worth investing in building a bot for your product or your service? We could start by, first of all, looking at just some cold, hard numbers. Last year, $170 million was invested in bots in just the first 8 months, which just goes to show that VCs are actually investing heavily in this area. This infographic shows that from June 2014 to July 2016, how many bot startups have been funded and to what extent and how much. And we can see that in the recent past, they're obviously being funded a lot more. And there's several companies that are really looking into it, such as Slack. Slack's partnered with VCs to help fund startups to be able to build bots for their platform. It would not only help the startups, it would help Slack as well and put them a bit more on the forefront of the technology. Messaging apps are opening up their APIs, so Facebook has made it really easy to release bots onto their platforms. And Facebook has actually made it their quest to want to use messaging as the main platform where users will do things like not just messaging, playing, buying, sharing, similar to WeChat that exists in China, where people are actually just using messaging as a medium to do most of their daily tasks. By 2020, Gartner predicts that the average person will have more conversations with bots than with their spouse. A little bit scary, but I think it does show the direction in which we're moving today. So people are spending more time on their phones, and it, with bots coming onto the phones and Alexa and Siri, it definitely shows the landscape that we're moving towards now. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues the other day, and he made a really interesting point. He said that every 20 years or so, a layer of abstraction is removed between the computer and the human. So if we think all the way back to the beginning, when computers were first made, the way that people interacted with it was through punch cards. So you have you, the punch card, and the computer, and that was the interaction. Maybe 20 or so years later, we have the command terminal. We don't have a graphical user interface as we know today, but we have a terminal where you can directly interact with the computer. Then, 20 or so years later, we have the graphical user interface with analogies that we understand a little bit better today. So a desktop, a trash can, folders, documents, that whole paradigm makes more sense to the world that we live in today. And then again, later, Steve Jobs pioneers touchscreens for iPhone, iPad. That is to say, we don't just interact via a mouse and a keyboard, but we can actually touch it and interact with it that way. And now, 2017, we're looking at the language, starting to speak the same language as the computers, being able to interact with them through natural language and actually get things done in that way, starting to understand each other a little bit better. So what are some of the pros of building a bot platform? First of all, with bots, you are leveraging an existing platform, being Facebook Messenger, Slack, or any other ones, which means that the users are already there. The barrier to accessing them is so much lower, and the cost for user acquisition is much lower as well. Secondly, messaging is a known paradigm. We've all grown up with language. We know how to speak and converse with people, which makes it intuitively easy to use. Messaging apps are now close to surpassing social networks. So if we see in this graph, this line would be the social networks, and the green line would be the messaging apps. And it's basically showing that people are spending more time messaging, more time talking to other people rather than being in the social networks. But it's not all rosy. There are some cons to it. Functionality is not easily discoverable. So if we are working with a messaging platform, we don't have the screen real estate as we would with software, other software, which means that we have to make everything very clear through language, what the functionality is, what the value added is for the user, how is this actually going to change their life and simplify the task they're trying to achieve. Which is also the UX challenge that we have to work with having absolutely no visual affordance. So we don't have buttons, color, typography. We can't use any of that to our advantage, so we have to be very clever with the way that we phrase things. Because it's a completely new environment, well, relatively new in how we know it today, bigger investments in advertising are needed, which means we need to teach people not only that the bot exists, but how can they use it, what value is it going to add to them, where does it fit into their life. And this could be done through bombarding people with advertising, but that would also be larger costs as well. And then lastly, it's an evolving environment, much like blockchain 2 years ago, very new. People didn't quite know exactly how it would fit into various companies and technologies. So it's unstable and unpredictable, and we do need some time to understand where it's best applicable. This is an example that Sergey has actually put together, but I thought it illustrated the point very well on not getting caught up in the hype. So in this example, if you were to create a form where you have to submit a meter reading, you could do it in a form quite easily by first plugging in your name, postcode, address. Could be done in just one tap if it's a browser autofill, and then plugging in your meter reading, and then just submitting it. So it's a relatively pretty straightforward process. But let's say you wanted to make a bot, just because why not? You'd have to turn that whole process into a conversation, and you'd have to see, first of all, ask the user who they are, where are they, structure everything in much more of a lengthy way. And you yourself have to probably type in a lot of the conversation, which the bot then needs to be able to extract from and understand what you're saying. And you need to affirm, yes, this is what I said. No, that's not what I meant. Go back. And it leaves a lot more room for error. So we can see clearly here in a form, 7 taps. In a conversation, 110 taps. This would be a good example of when not to use a bot. So how does the UX process look when we are designing bots? What is the role of the designer when it comes to bots? Well, computers are amazing at computation, and humans are not that great at computation, but we are amazing at understanding human emotion, understanding users, being able to go out there and do the contextual inquiries, do the research that's needed for it. Which means that designers have to become the experts on designing for natural language, and we need to really understand how to communicate with the users. The UX process, this is the process that I use. I've done quite a lot of research on how various companies do it, but in my experience, they're all relatively similar in a lot of ways, but I found this has worked the best. If you think about traditional UX process, you always want to start with gathering the requirements, defining the scope. Gathering requirements, same as always, understanding who you're designing for, what's the business proposition, doing some personas, experience mapping, user journeys, all that could still very well apply to this. But the key thing that you want to make sure you absolutely do is defining the scope. You don't want to have a bot that doesn't have an objective. So for example, if you were to open up a bot and you say randomly, today is a lovely day, and the bot's objective is to get you to go somewhere and buy something, they could then use that and say, you know what, it is a lovely day, but where is it a lovely day? Because if you're here, I'd suggest you go to this shop and buy this and this amazing ice cream to enjoy your lovely day. And in that way, you can use your scope to really start to guide the user to get them to what you want them to do. Then we have defining the core conversation. And the core conversation is not just, okay, now we know what we want it to do, let's just script out exactly what the bot says, what we expect the user to say. First of all, you want to define the pathways of the conversation before you go into the nitty-gritty of the scripting. So the core conversation would probably be most similar to information architecture, wireframing, before you gloss it all out and make sure that the conversation is true to your brand. And then scripting, developing, testing. I've bulked these into one because it's such an iterative process. You sit down next to the UX designer sits down next to your developer, and you sit together, write out the script, figure out the logic to parse out that language. How do you best iterate on that? And then lastly, once you have a prototype you're relatively happy with, you can go back and QA it with that script. Just to hone in a little bit more on what I mean by defining the core conversation, this is an image that I've taken from Google's conversational design team and thought it was very useful in illustrating how they define core conversations. So you wouldn't think about saying, okay, the bot will say exactly this sentence and they will respond this way. But you'd think about each bubble as a user intent or a user goal or where they might end up. Once that's all drawn down, we go into what I like to call peer botting. I'm sure we've all heard about peer coding. For bots, I'd say once you, as a UX designer, sit down and start scripting it, to literally sit next to the developer, and as the developer codes, looking at how you're phrasing things, how you might best phrase it for the coder to be able to best parse out the information, and basically become one throughout the process. A lot of people might think that when you are building a bot, you build it, you test it, you deploy it, and then you continue on that way. But actually, the process is very much more build, test, build, test, build, test, deploy, build, test, build, test, build, test. So it's very iterative. And the more you iterate on this, the better it becomes, especially as you evolve the language throughout. This is a great time to look at rapid prototyping. There's a lot of good tools out there where you can plug in the conversation, see the conversation flow for yourself. One tool I'd recommend, BotFrame. It's like a quick and dirty tool. You can plug in, bot says this, user might respond this, bot would respond this way, and you can see how the flow goes visually and get a better feel for what it is rather than getting stuck into the scripting. The only drawback is BotFrame is only for Messenger, and within Messenger we have structured inputs such as carousels, and that doesn't exist in this one. Another one that I would recommend would be Bot Society. This one can be used for multiple platforms, so Slack, Telegram, lots of different platforms. It does have the carousel functionality, but what I really liked about it was that as you're speccing out the conversational path, you can actually spec out different paths. So you can say, okay, I've given the user 3 buttons to click on. If they click on this, this is my response. If they click on that, this is my response. And you can map it out with a bit more detail. For those of us who like Sketch, I know I've used Sketch a lot in the past, and it does create something more visual but less interactive. Mockups has created a Sketch template that could be used as well. Basically, with bots, with conversational design, the key thing to keep in mind is we don't have the same tools that we normally do. We don't have any control over visual appearance. We don't have the same wireframing and visual design processes that we normally would. But what we are doing is hitching a ride on someone else's platform. So you always have to be aware of the guidelines that they have, how they want you to have your conversational style, what structured inputs are available, and respect those. If your platform's voice controlled, you don't even have the slight visual affordance of a chat interface, and then it becomes even more important what conversation you're saying. Basically, conversational design is storytelling, and your content, the way you phrase things, is your style. All of your features have to be reachable solely through words. So picking the right thing to say, when you're going to say it, at which point you're going to give it to the user, that becomes the most important thing during the design process. So just to go into some practical tips and tricks, what do you want to consider when you are actually doing the conversational design? As I mentioned before, the first thing you always want to do is to always introduce yourself. The moment that the user starts interacting with the bot, before they even do anything, the bot should always just say who they are, what their function is, and how they can help the user. And once they've done that, immediately follow it with a call to action. So in this example, it might be a bit blurry, but I've opened up a weather bot called Hi Poncho, and the first thing it tells me is, hi, I'm here to talk about the weather. If you could send me your location, I'll tell you exactly what the weather forecast is going to be. And then a button link right at the bottom where in one click I send the location and I get my weather update right away. Having no visible interface usually presents one of 2 problems, and that's also why it's so important to say what value you're going to add to the user. If you don't say what you're going to do, the user will do one of 2 things. They'll probably open up the app and say, I'd like you to just take me to the moon. Can you do that? Which is nothing to do with what we want the bot to be able to do. Or they'll open up the bot and just freeze, not use it, and leave right away. So always introduce yourself. Make sure it's clear with a call to action. Make your name relevant. So the name of the bot is your first touch point with your users. In these 3 examples, we have Shelf Joy with a picture of some glasses and a little book. This tells me, okay, shelf, book, bookshelf, maybe going to give me book recommendations. It's not immediately evident, but it does say something about what it actually is going to do. The next one, Alex Wikipedia bot. I'm assuming this is going to tap into the Wikipedia source and tell me everything I want to know about anything I'm asking. And then the last one, Pizza Express, at Pizza Express. That one doesn't get more clear, and I don't see a reason why it would need to be anything different. I'm sure I would open this, be able to book a table or place a delivery. The other thing with bots is when you're designing your bot, I know we talked about creating personas for users, but it's a good idea to think about the persona of your bot because that will then guide your conversational style and frame the conversation in that way. Don't pretend to actually be a human. This is called the uncanny valley, and basically it's saying on a spectrum from delight to dislike and completely robotic and perfect human being, people tend to, they don't connect with a robot like an industrial robot. They feel, okay, it's a robot, whatever, we don't care. But the more it resembles a human being, the more we relate to it, and the more we like it, the more we feel positive about it. Up until a certain point, which is when it's too similar to a human being, but we know they're not actually human, it dips significantly, and this is sort of where it gets a bit creepy. We don't really feel good about them. It's the same theory behind why some people don't like dolls or clowns. Zombies are supposed to be scary. They're not the feel-good element. Or any sort of creepy robots in movies that are very similar to human beings, but they're just not human, so you can't think of them as a human being. So how this relates to bots is we definitely want to make them likable. We want to make them close to human, but we don't want to say, yeah, we are actually a human being, because they'll just not like that. Give something before asking for something back. So in this example, I've talked to Domino's Pizza. I definitely would like a pizza. So I'm going through the process and I'm saying, okay, I want to order, I want a delivery. And once it knows what I want, it tells me, okay, great, so you want a delivery, I can do that for you, but I need to ask for your phone number in case you have any questions, or in case we have any questions about your order. So here, it's not just telling me, okay, we can do this for you, now give us something. It's also explaining why they're asking for something. Always try to leverage the platform that you're using. Use structured input wherever you can, and cheat basically wherever you can. The less taps you can make the user do, or the less work, the less the user has to talk, the better. Here we're looking for minimum input for maximum output, maximum value. In this example, I've talked to Mika, which is a hipster cat that gives me recommendations for hipster cafes and restaurants around the area. But I thought this was a really good example in showing a lot of various structured inputs just in one go, using URLs as cards, buttons instead of a keyboard, or buttons instead of a keyboard, not on this screen, but you have buttons baked into the UI. You have a location button, so you can one-click send the location, and they've even used emojis to compress the button, work with the space, and create a bit more of personality around it. There's a good resource on Chatbot Academy with a chatbot input cheat sheet that I definitely recommend having a look at on what types of structured input there are across the platforms. Time is money. I'm sure we've all heard someone say this at some point, if not in a Wall Street movie somewhere. But what this means for bots is that bot interactions have to be short and precise. A good rule of thumb to think about is the 10-second rule. As soon as the user opens up the bot, it has to be clear within 10 seconds what the value added is for the user. And the 30-second rule states that within 30 seconds, the user actually has to have gotten that value. If they haven't figured out what it's about and they haven't gotten what the value is, the actual value, they'll probably not use the bot again and think it might have been a bit pointless. A lot of bots fail because it takes too long for users to understand these things. Speaking of people leaving the bot, always have an exit strategy. So this means we know it's a bot. At some point, especially with where we're at with natural language processing, the bot won't be able to understand what you're saying. This means that you have to have a help function where the bot needs to say right away, okay, well, what you could say, so in Find, this is a bot that shows different places where you can buy shoes or sweaters or anything, and I don't really know what I want, so I've just clicked on Help, and it says, okay, well, you could type in, show me some black sneakers, and then I've sort of tested it a little bit. I'm like, yeah, well, I still don't get it, help, and he goes, oh, I don't have any products that fit that criteria. So kind of helps me a little bit, but not really. What would be better is to use structured input and be very clear and concise with what the bot can actually do and be able to execute the commands right away. So here, Hello Jarvis, it's a bot that is sort of a personal assistant, can set my reminders, see an example of what I can actually do, reset my time zone. But what I think would be ideal for bots would be to be able to give an option to talk to an actual human. So if I say, I'm really tired of talking to this robot, I just want to speak to a human being, that it gives me a link to customer service, a link to the support site, or some way of contacting people. Always ensure discoverability. So we don't actually have a way of showing the user what this bot can do, which means that the bot needs to suggest the features as training and then gradually take the training wheels off. This is the weather app where I've then said, okay, I'm in London, great, I've gotten my weather forecast. And then once I've gotten the weather forecast, it tells me right away, well, you can get a recurring weather forecast every morning. Do you want me to set this up for you? So that's a good example of how we can ensure discoverability. I've gone through a lot of guidelines and tips to consider when you are going through conversational design, but because this is an evolving environment and it is very new, especially when it comes to designing conversations, I would still urge all of you to experiment with the rules and have fun with it and see how we can make it even better. And then lastly, the last tip I would definitely suggest is personality is the new UX. This is what will set you apart from your competitors. In this weather app called Hi Poncho, which as you can see I absolutely love, but I've just played around with it and I've asked, are you a bot? And then he goes, I'm whatever you want me to be. I'm like, thanks. I want a pizza. And then he's telling me, I want something with pepperoni and tuna and 2 liters of milk. Hope we have the same taste in pizza. So this is almost like as if it has a personality of its own and it can relate to me. And I know it's a bot, but I'm still having fun with it. And in this other example, it gives me the option to play a game. And it does a play on words with a quote of one of my favorite bands, quit playing games with my heart. So just sort of fun things like that will make me go back to the bot, have fun with it, probably even advertise it myself, screenshot it, put it on social media. So yeah, in the past 45 minutes, we've covered the history of the bot, most notably that it's not a new thing. It's been around for a long time, but now we finally have a chance with machine learning, natural language processing to do some really interesting things. Do you really need a bot? There's a couple pros, a couple cons. You have to do bigger investment into the advertising of it, making sure people know what it's all about, but you are leveraging a platform. And then the UX process, it's very iterative. Make sure you work closely with your developers. And then some practical tips and tricks with making sure it has a personality if that applies to your brand, but most importantly, making sure that functionality is concise and discoverable. So I hope that was very useful for you all, and I'd like to open it up for some questions.